Every great story has a beginning, a journey filled with passion and a vision for change. Let's take a look at the incredible journey of Nalafem so far. It all started in October 2020 with the organization of 5 regional barazas consultations. These consultations paved the way for the co-creation of the Africa Young Women Beijing Plus 25 Manifesto. In November 2020, during the high-level intergenerational dialogue, the manifesto was officially presented to the UN Women and the African Union.
Africa Young Women Beijing Plus 25 Manifesto. And with this submission, I submit the voices, the aspiration, and the hopes and the demands of young women on our beloved continent. And we share now the responsibility and accountability across generations to make sure these demands of Generation Equality Forum are taken into account and acted on.
Over the following months, Nalafem tirelessly worked to gather support. They collected over 10,000 signatures from over 105 countries, both online and offline. Nala Feminist Collective is a Pan-African group of women politicians and activists with a mission to bridge the gap between policy and implementation, intergovernmental and grassroots spaces, as well as generational gap. Their efforts bore fruit when 8 out of the 10 demands of the Beijing Plus 25 Manifesto were adopted into the UN Action Coalition's Women, Peace and Security and Humanitarian Action Compact from April to June 2021.
شغل حرية كرامة وطنية. Jobs, freedom, dignity. It has always been a revolution for economic justice led by women and young people.
On July 1st, 2021, Nalafem was officially launched at the Generation Equality Forum in Paris, France. Since then, Nalafem has been leading the way, organizing 6 intergenerational dialogues for accountability in August 2021 and embarking on advocacy missions to several countries. In July 2022, the inaugural Nalafem Summit and Awards took place in Abuja, Nigeria, under the theme, I Am Nala. This landmark event brought together advocates, policymakers, and activists united in the fight against gender-based violence and for gender justice. During the summit, Nalafem also launched their book titled I Am Nala, which shares empowering stories and advocates for the Sustainable Development Goals, the demands of the Beijing Plus 25 Manifesto, and African Union Agenda 2063. With the launch of the Nalafem 5-year strategy spanning from 2023 to 2027, Nalafem is committed to advocating for accountability, investing in the socio-economic power of African women and girls, and elevating young African women into politics. To make a difference, Nalafem has devised flagship projects such as the Nalafem Academy, Nalafem Index, Multi-Generational Dialogues for Accountability, Nalafem Fund, and the annual Nalafem Summit. Through these initiatives, Nalafem aims to impact the lives of 1 million women and girls by 2027, nurturing an ecosystem for feminist transformation and amplifying the voices of African women and girls through various mediums, including activism and digital creatives. Also, in November 2022, Nalafem made its mark at COP27 in Egypt. They organized roundtables, supported African climate activists, and led a delegation of 8 young women to the conference. These dedicated activists raised their voices for climate action, advocating for a sustainable future. Alongside these impactful initiatives, Nalafem launched an inspiring podcast series. The I Am Nala podcast amplifies the voices and stories of African women and girls, shedding light on their challenges, triumphs, and aspirations. Nalafem's journey has been marked by collaborations and partnerships with organizations and individuals committed to women's rights and gender equality. We extend our utmost gratitude to our partners for their support. But the journey is far from over. Nalafem invites you to join the cause, to be part of this great vision and mission to liberate the African women and girl. Together, we are all Nala.
Welcome to the Nalafem Accountability Series for our 6th episode, Accountability Global to Africa. My name is Sayeda Reem Hussein and I will be your host today. We hope this series will continue to provide a platform to advance accountability conversations and bridge the gap between policy and implementation, making sure young feminists are at the forefront. As Nalafem, we are guided by the Africa Young Women Beijing Plus 25 Manifesto. Our advocacy now is focused on supporting member states to implement this manifesto. Take a look. To know more, you can visit our website. And to drive this conversation on accountability, let's use the hashtag #NalafemAccountability and #CSW68. For those watching, feel free to comment in the chat box or please leave your questions in the question and answer section. We began this series with an internal reflection of accountability, looking at what is needed from us as organizations and individuals to hold ourselves accountable to the commitments that we have made towards gender equality. We explored innovations around accountability and highlighted issue areas from data to funding. Today, we're happy to sit in reflection and action with our governments to look back at the advances made towards generation equality forum commitments, as well as explore the gaps that still need to be filled and the innovations being made to track commitments and hold governments accountable. I would like to now give a warm welcome to Ms. Florence Machio, who is from the Office of the President Advisor on Women's Rights from the Republic of Kenya and is particularly the gender-based violence lead. Welcome, Florence. We're so happy to have you here today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Florence, I'd like to specifically ask you and speak to, and I think it's important to recognize that last week we saw one of Kenya's largest protests calling for an end to femicide. And last year, the figure from Femicide Count Kenya was 152 murders. Abuse cases, as reported by the nonprofit Usikimye, are at 150 calls per day. How is the government of Kenya, as a commitment maker and leader on ending gender-based violence, going to work together with feminist organizations to ensure that gender-based violence is taken as seriously as national security issues?
I think women's rights is a national security issue, and the Office of the Women's Rights Advisor was created with that in mind. For it being in the Office of the President, it shows the President's acknowledgement that women's rights are as important as any other issue, hence the Women's Charter. Within the Women's Charter, the President acknowledges that gender-based violence is indeed an issue for us as a country, and hence also the office being created. Just before the biggest protest we had of grassroots women coming out, Honorable Harriet Chigai, who is the President's advisor for women's rights, raised a statement, and together with grassroots women organizations who were there during that press conference, and acknowledge the work that the grassroots women do on the ground, and also acknowledging the fact that while the government can do its part around the law, around preventive measures, around having protective measures and our response measures from judiciary, to the parliament in terms of laws, and also to the police. A lot of work also needs to be done at the grassroots level with the community so that we are able to change mindset, we are able to have a movement that respects women and acknowledges women's contribution. So the government is definitely working with the women's rights organization, and we are not in the assumption that this is work that can be done by government alone. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you so much, Florence. I'd like to welcome Alison to the stage, and Alison Humphrey is the thematic lead for feminist movement and leadership for the Action Coalition from UN Women. Welcome, Alison. I think you're muted.
I am so sorry. Good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Alison. So we've been speaking a lot in this webinar series about innovation. And the Action Coalition structure, I think, is an innovation of the JEF process. Please, if you don't mind, if you could just spend some time to just expand on what that is and the impact that it is having in terms of holding governments and different commitment makers accountable as a mechanism.
Sure, absolutely. I'm not going to waste time to talk about why JEF was needed. I think we all know what the data says about how far off we are from achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. But I think when you look at generation equality, the innovation that it embodies is one that I think we hadn't seen before on this international scale. You know, it embodies a kind of networked and inclusive multilateralism premised on dialogue, intergenerational solidarity, and partnerships. All the 6 action coalitions and the compact were designed to be a multi-stakeholder collective. So we have member states, civil society, youth, philanthropic organizations, international non-governmental organizations, UN system coming together on a shared agenda, right? So through generation equality, for the first time, I think we asked the world to come together on an equal footing and actually walk the talk, right? To move beyond just the speeches, make bold and public commitments to back the rhetoric that we've been hearing for so long. So one thing I want to flag as well about the innovative nature of generation equality is that, you know, the action coalitions were co-created by a very collaborative process, right? And the accountability framework monitors implementation of the promises made. And accountability really is the cornerstone of success for generation equality. What we see working through this innovative structure, one, we see the breaking of silos, right? If we look at, just to give you some some examples, if we look at the African continent, we see countries like Burkina Faso, Kenya, you've heard from our dear Florence earlier, Malawi, really breaking through and trying to break down the silos and increase ownership, collaboration, and coordination in order to implement the commitments. I referenced Burkina Faso. Just want to give an example. They have a national steering committee, for example, that was made in consensus with civil society organizations to help the coordination and collaboration of efforts. And that's not unique to Burkina Faso. We see that also in Tanzania and in Malawi as well, and also in Kenya as well. Another thing I think that is very important to note is the way that generation equality has brought stakeholders, again, at the table in a way that has never been done before. We have youth, civil society, member states, private sector, philanthropies, all at the table in spaces that were not accessible before, to all of them. We also see through the Action Coalition structures that coordination and alignment between government bodies are happening, because that's fundamental to advance a cross-cutting gender policy agenda. So in a lot of the commitment maker as it relates to member states, we see it's not just housed in the women's machinery, for example, but there has to be coordinated efforts across different government ministries to ensure that they are implementing the commitments that are made and being held accountable for that. I think I can stop there now, but I can elaborate further later on.
Thank you so much, Alison. So I'd like to turn back to Florence. Just on that same tone on innovations, and I think like Alison also talks about how Kenya also has has innovated as well, similarly creating these bodies or these spaces that are co-created by civil society, including young feminists as well. We spoke about this a bit before, but if you could share with us, so the Office of the President, Women's Advisor, is a new organ, right? If I could just invite you to just share a little bit about more about the vision of this office, and how it hopes to achieve, or what it hopes to achieve when it comes to Kenyan women and girls, and involving especially marginalized Kenyan women and girls. And also, if you could speak to about the future of this office.
Well, thank you very much. Just adding on to what Alison has said, of course, within when Kenya committed itself under Generation Equality Forum, within the Ministry of Gender, there's a whole coalition of civil society organizations, government agencies, and donor bodies, public and private partnership around generation equality. But also even before generation equality, Kenya had already put together the gender sector working group, which involves donors, which involves government agencies, which also involves private sector and civil society organizations coming together and breaking down gender issues under different thematic areas, including gender-based violence. Now, the Office of the Women's Rights Advisor is one of the offices that the president promised when he came into power in terms of implementing the Women's Charter. The Women's Charter illuminates the dream that the president has and the government has around women's rights. And one of the key things that the president spoke about were two things: care work and sexual and gender-based violence, as part of the reasons that he's put the Women's Rights Advisor's Office in place, with the idea of it being a women's rights agency. And for now, what we are focused on is making sure that the implementation of the Women's Charter happens, and also the better plan, the bottom-up economic agenda also happens, because we know women are at the pillar, at the lowest level when it comes to medium and small enterprises, and therefore we want the economic empowerment to lead to also the reduction of gender-based violence. So our key work is to coordinate across ministries, not necessarily implementing, but coordinating, because sometimes when you have a gender desk in the Ministry of Agriculture, it will only look at gender within agriculture. But when you look at the Women's Rights Office, it looks at women's rights across all sectors. So that's where this office is positioned and how this office is positioned, and especially in the president's office, because he takes this quite seriously. Did I answer your question? Or did I miss something?
No. Yes, you did. Thank you so much.
Right.
And it'd be really interesting. I think that we have, as Nalafem, been following just the development of this office into this, and I think it's really important. That it's something that we talk about in different spaces, and a lot of people voices. I think, like you said, that gender or women are always lumped together with youth. and in some countries it's even, it's gender, youth, and sports.
Yeah.
So it's really important, I think, to this move, and it's a great innovation for Kenya.
It's very refreshing to just have the lens of women without making, what about so and so? Like, that's a conversation that always happens in Africa. Or what about the boy child? And what about so and so? And so for us as an office, it gives us pleasure to be at such a time like this, to be in this office, to be able to support the women's rights advisor to actualize the rights of Kenyan women in different spaces. And I think you mentioned something about grassroots. One of the statements that Honorable Harriet gave just in the wake of this femicide killings that we had is that she's going around the country engaging with women at the grassroots. Because until you hear the voices of the women beyond what we see, we know there are many cases that are not reported, but until you hear, then the solutions will not make sense. The context in Marsabit, for example, in northern Kenya will not be the context in Kwale in southern Kenya. So Honorable Harriet is keen to engaging women at the grassroots level so that the solutions that we offer at this office stems from the voices of the women themselves. Thank you. Sorry to take up more time.
No, thank you so much. So we have a question in the chat to you, Florence, and it's from Sharon Mboya, who says, I'd like to ask Florence to please shed light on why the president has not talked about the issue that we are facing at the moment.
All right. Thank you, Sharon Boyer, for your question. And I think that question has come up over and over again. But the Office of the Women's Rights Advisor, which sits in the Office of the President, has spoken and has issued a statement way before there was the protest. And it does not mean that the president does not take this seriously, but you have seen action from the different agencies from government. You've seen Ministry of Tourism. You've seen Ministry of Gender. You've seen them come together, especially with the linkage of Airbnbs, and formulate, because they are policy formulating arms of the government. They've come together. You've seen the Director of Criminal Investigations when we were sharing our statement from the Office of the Women's Rights Advisor. The DCI was there, speaking on behalf of that arm of government, because our job is to pull all of them together. And you have seen there's a special team that was created by government. And so what we are seeing is action from the presidency to speak into the issues that women are facing at the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Florence. I'd like to turn to Alison for just a follow-up question. I think a lot of people, a lot of feminist organizations have all been wondering, how do we get more involved with the action coalitions, and also how can we get more information, or like updated information on what is happening within those action coalitions?
Yeah, sure. No, that's a very good question, and thanks for that. The Action Coalition, at any point you can express interest to become a commitment maker in the Action Coalitions. The Action Coalitions have very clear blueprints and a global action plan that speaks to action areas that each action coalition will focus on for the duration of generation equality. But there are also opportunities to make commitments across all the action coalitions if they align with the work of your organization, or choose one. Generation Equality has its own dedicated website. I can drop that information in the chat. And there's just go, very simple. You click the interest form, fill out the information about your organization, the work that you're doing, all of that. And the after due process, you'll be able to join on as commitment makers. For Action Coalition, is important to note, though, since we're talking about accountability, by signing on to be a commitment maker, you will be asked to report on the work that you're doing. And if you allow me to just talk a little bit about that, through the accountability and the reporting mechanisms that are in place through the Action Coalition, we've learned a lot about primarily where the gaps are, right? We're hearing a lot from civil society organizations, from grassroots organizations, from youth-led organizations about the funding gap, the immense funding gap that exists and that inhibits them from being able to continue the work that they're doing in a sustainable manner. And so the framework is such that while we are holding the commitment makers accountable for the commitments, commitment makers are also holding leaders and the rest of the international system accountable for providing resources that they need to be able to do the work that they're doing. So the accountability through the Action Coalition is definitely go both ways. But interested to join, just reach out to look at the website, sorry. You would find all the news, the latest news about what's happening with Action Coalitions there. And then once you're part of a particular Action Coalition, there are regular convenings with the leadership structure, with commitment makers, so that it continues to be a collective sort of community with good practice, peer learning, and support to really advance the agenda.
Thank you, Alison. So I'm seeing in the chat a lot of questions. So another question to you, Florence. And I think this is also a space. I think this shows possibly the need for more spaces like this, with where people can get in touch and just speak directly to government. So sorry to bring you up again, Florence. But we have a question from Evelyn Miner, who says that she's impressed to learn about the women economic empowerment through the bottom-up approach. And she'd like to ask how the government intends to involve women at the grassroots level in the formulation and implementation of the women economic empowerment agenda, so that it deviates from the usual top-down agendas. Are there public participation forums lined up? Is her question. And are the grassroots women involved in the decision-making for us?
Okay, thank you. I wish then my colleague who leads on the economic empowerment was here, but let me attempt to respond to what's her name again? Sorry, I didn't see the question.
Evelyn Miner.
Evelyn. So thank you, Evelyn, for your question. One of the things that you'll be seeing soon, remember, this is the newest baby on the block in terms of the Women's Rights Advisor's Office, is you'll be seeing a lot of grassroots engagement, a lot of grassroots women engagement across the 47 counties on the same subject. And so, Evelyn, you've actually preempted, which is a good thing, but it's coming round. I think there's a launch coming out at the end of February to just engage across all the 47 counties. And so across the counties, what I've been telling the different civil society organizations is when we're on the ground, we know you are there, we know you're working in certain aspects. If you're in a particular area, you're in Baringo, for example, we'll be calling out on you because we want it to be an organic movement of women who are engaging with government so that the solutions they give speak, or the solutions that are offered to them speak to what they're experiencing on the ground. So it's coming. Everything has been put together, but it's coming, especially on the economic empowerment front. And even as we do that, the other aspect, which is what I lead on, matters GBV, the context in different counties, we are taking that in consideration so that the solutions are homegrown. Also, civil society has been working with women on the ground. We are not devoid of that fact, and engaging them at that level so that homegrown solutions for engaging communities, different traditional aspects are considered as we come up with the solutions for some of the things that we face as women. So thank you very much, Evelyn, for your question.
Thank you, Florence. So earlier on in the conversation, there was a comment by Fatima Muazu, who was speaking to trying to get clarity on like these spaces. So the spaces, I think that Florence, that you mentioned in terms of civil society, like public forums, and Alison, the different like action coalition, the spaces that are held within that. But particularly this question, Fatima's question was to the accessibility of these spaces, particularly for young women with disabilities. If I could invite both Florence and Alison to the stage, we can just have a conversation about that, because I think like a lot of the times when we're speaking about a lot of these issues that we in terms of like GBV, Florence, which is your area, and Alison, feminist leadership and feminist movements. People living with disabilities are often missing from this conversation. So what is the Office of the President doing to ensure that they are part of the conversation? And what is UN Women doing as well?
I'm glad to start first, Alison. Actually, one of the first meetings we had when the office began and I joined the team is we had a meeting with women with disabilities, and just to see the nuances across sectors when it comes to women and girls living with disabilities. So that was the first thing that we did. And that is nuanced in every solution that we are bringing on board, every advisory that we are sharing with the president. And going forward, the solutions that we're coming up with that we are sharing with different ministries, especially implementing ministries. So that is part and parcel of what we're doing, whether we're doing economic empowerment, whether we're talking about agriculture, whether we're talking about GBV, all that is factored in. And again, our office is an open door policy. We are at Tourism Fund Building, second floor. Women, this is your office. You can bring your petitions. You can bring your issues so that they are factored in. Thank you so much.
I can jump in, right? No, that's such a critical question. For the Feminist Movements and Leadership Action Coalition, let me start there. One of our leaders is Women Enabled International, which works on the nexus of gender and disability rights. And for our action coalition, it's absolutely critical to center the rights of women with disabilities as well. So there was the launch through Generation Equality. There was a launch of what's called the Feminist Accessibility Protocol, groundbreaking work, which is a set of about 13 accessibility related commitments to ensure meaningful participation of persons with disabilities, including women and girls of all ages, right? It aligns with the SDGs, specifically SDG 10, of course, SDG 5, sorry, and aims to reduce inequality by empowering and promoting social, economic, and political inclusion for all. And because this action coalition, the Feminist Movements and Leadership Action Coalition, champions this protocol, we ensure that it is at the center of everything that we do. But beyond that, the leaders of the Action Coalition and the commitment makers also are quite keen and have been very active to ensure that this cuts across other action coalitions as well. So it is not solely dependent on one organization or the organizations that are focused on disability rights and not on the shoulders of just the disability rights activists to champion this work, but it becomes a collective sort of principle that grounds the work of Generation Equality. So we ensure that all spaces are accessible. Now, again, it's a work in process. There's always space for improvement, but this definitely is one of the ideals that we hold very, very dear. I hope that answers. And if you need information about the Feminist Accessibility Protocol, I can also drop that in the chat for you as well.
Yes, please do. I'm seeing there's a lot of activity in the chat, and these resources and information is very helpful for us as feminist organizations. So thank you so much for that, Alison. We have a question, and I'd like to, again, to address this to both Alan and Florence about the framing of some of these issues. So particularly, this is Valentine Otieno, who's asking a question. Who's asking, kindly asking if the government has criminalized GBV, and if not, what are some of the measures or actions being put into place at the national level to manage this issue? So also to add on to Valentine's question, is that that there is there's a difference between just saying end gender-based violence versus criminalize gender-based violence. So the Africa Young Women Beijing Plus 25 manifesto, as you know, specifically and strategically calls for the criminalization of gender-based violence. But Generation Equality calls for the ending of gender-based violence. But we're seeing, and I think like through Valentine's question, we're really seeing like young feminists calling specifically for criminalizing GBV. So I'll pass that question to Florence in terms of are there any steps that are happening, either in the Office of the President in terms of your advocacy, or in other areas of the government to try and move legislation or policy towards criminalizing, and the language being criminalizing gender-based violence?
All right. As we all know, Kenya has enacted various, vibrant legislations to curb gender-based violence. We have the Anti-FGM Act, we have the Sexual Offences Act, we have I can't remember all of them, but we have different laws around GBV that provides a national framework for criminalization of gender-based violence and sexual and gender-based violence in Kenya. Indeed, when the Honorable Harriet, the President's advisor on women's rights, shared her statement, she said, and together she was in that press conference with the Deputy Speaker of the National Assembly, Gladys Boshele, and the member of the Senate, Madam Catherine Muma. The conversation in that statement was coming together to tighten the laws that we have, and specifically around femicide, because what we are seeing and the different trends we are seeing calls for more stringent measures. And we have seen, even in the trends, that there's technologically facilitated GBV, which even in the framework of the Sexual Offences Act, it's not very strong and clear, but we need to be able to, as a country, push for that advancement within the National Assembly. And so the Deputy Speaker was there, she mentioned that, the Senate was there, they mentioned that, and therefore that is one of the things that going forward is going to happen with the other arm of government, which is the National Assembly.
Thank you so much for that, Florence. So I'd like to pass a similar question to Alison, particularly speaking to the gap or the difference between what young feminists are calling for in terms of the language being criminalizing versus what Jeff says in terms of just ending.
Yeah, sure. I can try to touch a little bit on that, noting that my expertise is not particularly in GBV. But if you look at again, the Global Acceleration Plan that outlines the indicators and the tactics for the Action Coalition, you'd see almost all of them speak to laws, right? As one of the indicators that's being measured, which laws are being changed, which ones are actually translating into concrete results and action. And I think that's a very important tool, I want to say, being used to evaluate, I guess, progress. You talk about the language. I think criminalization of GBV is something that is absolutely important. And I'm speaking here, taking off my Action Coalition hat and speaking as from UN Women's perspective, and the former executive director, which you guys know all very well, Madam Pumzile, spoke to that all the time, the importance of naming it for what it is and criminalizing perpetrators as one of the key steps in addressing ending violence against women. I think using the term ending all just covers, in my opinion, something just a bit more broad, not removing the importance of criminalizing, but it also covers social norms and other key issues that are instrumental to what's happening now in the agenda for gender-based violence. So I think it doesn't negate the need to criminalize, it just tries to have more of a broader umbrella so that we don't get people saying, well, you didn't talk about this, you only spoke about that. And we want to make sure that it covers when we're addressing all aspects of ending violence against women, gender-based violence against women.
Thank you, Alison. So, there's also specifically maybe in speaking to the Action Coalition on Feminist Leadership, what does that look? So when we speak about also in the Africa Beijing Plus 25 manifesto, it speaks on when it was being drafted or created by young women. It was very much being talked to in the framework of having it being an intergenerational space. Could you speak to just the characteristic of the Action Coalition on Feminist Leadership in terms of the intergenerationality? I probably made that word up, but of that space.
No, absolutely. I will be the first to say that specifically for the Feminist Movements and Leadership Action Coalition, in terms of the leadership structure, we always can use more strong youth-led organizations in that leadership structure. We do have some at the moment, but always need more. Something that the Action Coalition is very clear about, not only because one of our Action Area 4 speaks to the importance of, or the goal of, strengthening youth-led and adolescent girl organizations, their leadership, and also funding the sustainability of their work. Something that's very clear in all the spaces that we occupy is it's important to make the distinction between youth-focused organizations and youth-led organizations. Because when you look at funding, for example, a lot of organizations that are youth-focused get funded, but the ones that are led by young women don't receive very much of the funding. Funding doesn't trickle down to the youth-led organization, and that's an important gap that we're really trying to draw attention to and to bridge. I'm sorry if I got carried away and missed your question, but just wanted to point that out, acknowledging that engaging with not just the leadership structure of Action Coalitions, but the youth leaders across all Action Coalitions and the commitment makers is absolutely central to the work of generation equality. The demands, not just from the African Young Women's Manifesto, but from the Youth Manifesto through Generation Equality, are very clear, and they are central to the work that Action Coalitions do.
Thank you so much, Alison. If I could call, so I think coming up, I'm just looking at the chat, Florence, and I think there's a very strong call to action that's coming from the young women who are in the chat box right now. I mean, I think this speaks to what also we're talking about in terms of accountability and how we hold our leaders accountable in terms of the. And I'll share with you, I think, Rachel Kagoya's statement, which says, thanks, Florence. In addition to the ministries and the Women's Rights Office, as a Kenyan woman, I would like that the president publicly pronounces himself and condemns femicide and gender-based violence. And I think we see this, we're seeing this in the chat from various women and various organizations specifically really wanting to hear the president. And I think that speaks to us, as feminist organizations and as young feminists, wanting to hear directly from our leaders, and not just our leaders' offices or things like that, but the leader itself, to ending, in this case, speaking publicly about and condemning feminicide. So I think that would be, a call to action that's coming from the young women who are part of this conversation today. And I'd like to, pass that to you, Florence, to take forward to Honorable Chigai, and hopefully His Excellency as well.
I hear
before
you. And noted. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Florence. Before we end, so traditionally on this webinar, we often invite our speakers to complete this statement, which is, I am Nala because, and I know Florence is familiar with this request. So we'll start with Florence. Florence, if you could please complete this statement. I am Nala because.
I am Nala because until all women are safe, I am not safe.
Thank you so much, Florence. Alison, I am Nala because.
I am Nala because I believe in the transformative power of the young feminist movement. And I believe that it's only through that we can make true progress.
Thank you, Alison. And on that note, just celebrating all the young women who are on the chat today, who are watching. We see you. And thank you to our great panel, Florence, Alison, for sharing such valuable insights with us today, and taking the time to engage our audience in the chat box, as well as sharing different resources and material. We will be sharing that as well on our social media, so please continue to follow us, and we will compile those and share it with you. So thank you all for joining us today. We hope that our discussion today has contributed to promoting the importance of accountability. Please join us in our next webinar on March 1st, where we will be celebrating and holding space for the different conversations we have hosted over the last 6 months and giving viewers a sneak peek into the Nalafem Accountability Toolkit. Please stay tuned on our social media platforms for more information. And feel free to reach out to us on email at facilitate@nalafem.org to suggest speakers for our next webinar, or simply to share your feedback. Follow us on social media and continue to use the hashtags #NalafemAccountability and #CSW68. We will be meeting every Friday of the month and can't wait to see you all next month. Thank you, everybody.